Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Sheldon, how are you?
I'm good, Baruch Hashem. Thank you, bro.
Hi, Lewis.
Okay. I should call you.
Here we are in the Masechta Baba Basra. Today's going to be a very short daf. You can see it's like 6 lines, and then the other page is going to be like another 7, 10 lines. Very short daf today. Um,
Okay.
so, so first we're going to start from Kuf Samech Amid Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. Umar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Umar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, we're talking about, he says a halacha. First thing Rabbi Yochanan says, call hamachokin, any eraser on a document. So Rabbi Yochanan says, if you're going to erase something on a document, you have to validate what you wrote. In other words, take for granted writing. To write and then to erase, it's not a big deal to rip up what you wrote. But to them, it was a very big deal to write something. So let's say you're writing a document, a loan document, and you have to erase something. So you're allowed to erase it. It doesn't invalidate the document, but before the Eidim sign on the star, you have to write that I made a mistake over here. The eraser over here is, you have to like initial that you agree to the erasing part of the document. That's what he says. There is a part of the document that if you erase, it's totally invalidated at the total end of the document. But in the beginning, in the middle, before you get to the actual last words of the document, if you have an erase, kol hamachokim, anytime you erase something, all of them, the dame kiyumen. You have to write validating. I erased it, validating I'm validating what I wrote. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says. So that's the first halacha over here, that you're allowed to erase in a document, but you just have to rewrite that you agree to those erasers that's part of the original document. And then this is the main topic of today's daf. It's a very important daf. The last line of every document should not have any new clause. What should the last line do? It should be a summary, a review of what the document discuss. So that's what he says. In the last line of a document, you have to repeat and review the topic of the document in the last line. That you can't write a new clause in the last document. So the Gemara asks, "My tama, what's not? What's the reason? Why can't they have a document without a review at the bottom, and just even in the last line of the document having like a clause of the document? That's an important part of the agreement." So now we go to the Amud Aleph on Kuf Samach Beis Amud Aleph. So we started from Kuf Samach Aleph. So today's Kuf Samach Beis. Amar Rav Amram explained. Lefi she'ein lemedin mishita achrayna. The reason why we don't want you to write is because we can't learn new clauses from the last line. Why is that? So in a regular document, the Eidim really are supposed to sign right after the last line. Eidim are supposed to sign. Right? That's what you're supposed to have. You have the text of the document, and right under the last line, witnesses are supposed to sign. The problem is that witnesses, especially in those days, you can't get them to sign very close to the last line of a document. Usually they're nervous about their handwriting, and they're going to leave generally a space of a line between the last words of the document and their signatures. That's just the way it is. So the last line, they're going to leave a space. So therefore, if you're going to leave that empty, then because they didn't sign correctly, then what's going to happen is the one holding the document could write a word, a clause between the signatures of the witnesses and the end of the document. He could write a clause to his benefit, and he fill it in. So therefore, we say like this: even if he fills it in with a new clause. We're not going to pay attention to the last line of a document. That's what he says. You never pay attention to the last line, to no matter what. So as good advice, just if you have an extra line in the document, just have a review of the document. Because if you're going to put a new clause in that last line, we're not going to pay attention to it. There's a new rule that there's no such a thing that we're going to apply any clause that's written on the last line on the document. Okay? So therefore, the Rabbanim said you have to review it. So therefore, even if they would forge a new clause, we're not going to lose anything because we're not going to learn anything. And and so there's no incentive to write anything. Amalei Rav Nachman Rav Amam. So Rav Nachman said to Rav Amam, how do you know that you're supposed to leave that this idea that if there are two lines vacant between the signatures of the document, then it's going to be an invalid document. But if there's one line space in between the end of the document and the signatures, that's okay. So Amalei, so he said, Rabbi Amram said, I have a source in a brisa. The Tanya we learned in a brisa. Hirchik es edim shnei shitim min aksav. If the edim distance themselves 2 lines from the bottom of the text, 2 lines, they distance themselves and then they sign the name. Puzzle, the whole document is invalid because there's too much of a space there, and this document becomes open to chicanery, forgery, because a guy could put in those 2 lines, he could put in some strange clause to his benefit, the one holding the document. But shita achas, but if he would leave one blank space between the signatures of the Eidim and the text of the document, if there's one blank space, that's okay, kosher. Because why? Why? Again, the Gemara is going to explain it, but I'm just saying it out loud. If you leave one space, so what's the guy going to do holding the document? He's going to put a clause there? We're never going to pay attention to the last line. We're never going to pay attention to that last line. We don't learn anything, a last line before the Eidim, we don't pay any attention. Therefore, if you want to have it, if the Eidim are signing up to the last line, just have the last line repeat what it says in the document. Because even if you leave it empty, it's going to be a kosher. But if you're going to write an important clause in that last line, we're not going to give it any validation. And that's the pasuk. That's what the Gemara says. My shnor shnei titim. Why is a document invalid if there are 2 empty line spaces between the text of the document and where the Eidim are signing? Because because we are always concerned, mezayef v'kosav. The one holding the document is going to put, a fake clause and fill it up in those 2 lines. So the Gemara asked, then what shita achas nami mizayef v'kosav? Then why, if you leave one line spacing between the Eidim and the document, he's also going to fill it up with his own clause that benefits him. So why is shita achas, if there's one spacing of line between the Eidim and the text, it would be kosher. Lalav shmamina, from here's a proof. Ein lemeidim shita achroina. We're never going to pay attention to that last line. So even if the owner of the shtar, the holder of the shtar, is going to write some clause in there, we're never going to even give it any validation. We're just going to ignore it because we don't learn anything. No new conditions can be paid attention to if it's written on the last line of the document. So therefore, if it's empty, that last line, it's going to be kosher. Shma mina, this was the source of where Rav Raman got his idea that you don't learn anything from the last line of a document. And therefore, a good idea was what Rabbi Yochanan said. A good idea was that last line, if there happens to be a space between where the Eidim signed and where the text ends, if you want to fill it in with just a review of what the shtar is all about. You can say, like, this is a loan document. Now we go to Amud Beis. That was the fastest Amud Aleph. Now we go to Amud Beis. Ibayalahu. So now we're going to ask the question. What happens? Let's say every line's an inch. right? Let's say every line on this document is an inch. You said if you leave over 2 inches between the end of the document and where the Adam signing, it's invalid, the document. What happens if you leave an inch and a half? So it's a shita umechza. You left over a line and a half. Here's the question: shita umechza mai. If you left over a line and a half, what would be the din? So you tell me it's invalid if it's two lines spacing. If it's valid if there's a 1 line spacing. What happens if there's a line and a half? Is it valid? So Tashma or not? Tashma, come in here. Hirchik edim shnei shitim. If you distance the witnesses 2 lines from the end of the document, pasa, then and only then is the document invalid. So we can derive from that. That ends the brisa. Hashita or mechza. But if there was a line and a half, kosher, then the document would be kosher. So we see that a line and a half of spacing would still make it a kosher document. But that's only the beginning of the brisa. Eina seifa. Let's quote the end of the brisa. The end of the brisa said, shita achas kosher. Only if there's a 1 space line between the text of the document and where the Adam is signing, it's kosher. But shich achas the kosher. Only if there's 1 line spacing, is it then kosher? Hashita omekta. But if you leave a line and a half of spacing, possible the document would be invalid. So is it a valid document or invalid document? From this brisa, you can't derive anything. So we still left with our question. Question is, if at the end of the document you left, instead of 1 line of spacing, you left a space and a half, does that invalidate the whole document? So my have Allah. What's the bottom line? What's the halacha? Tashma, come in here. I have a new brisa. The Tanya, we learned in a brisa, hirchik eso edim shnei shitim min aksav. If you distance the text 2 lines from the text of the line, so then possible the document is invalid. Okay, but now here the brisa is more clearer in its language. Pachas mekan, but if it's less spacing than 2 lines, let's say it's a line and a half, so kosher. Here the brisa doesn't say if it's 1 line it's kosher. It says anything less than 2 spaces, 2 lines, it's kosher. So if a line and a half of spacing is left, then it's kosher. And it makes sense that way. Because even if you fill in a clause over there, right, you're going to have to make it in a smaller font because you only have a line and a half of spacing. And once you're going to start playing around with the font, people are going to see that something was tampered with this document. And so they'll start questioning it. So therefore, only if it's 2 line spacing from the Adam to the text of the document is it invalid. But anything less than that is kosher. Finally, we'll just finish over here. One last line here. Hoya abba. Now let's say you finish the text of the document, okay? And instead of having 2 normal Adam sign at the end of the text, you had, let's say, 2 Adam that are relative sign at the bottom of the text, and then underneath that you had 2 kosher Adam. Here is a better. So the text ends, and now a new thing happens. You have 5 signatures on this document. 4 or 5 witnesses, chasumin al hashtar, are written on the shtar. Okay, let's say you have 4. Okay. And one of them is invalid. He's a relative, or he's just a person that's like a thief, who's a disqualified to being a witness. Tiskayim edus b'shar. Then the edus, then the rest of the document is still valid because you still have 2 kosher edim. So let's say the top 2 edim apostle, you'll be mekayim it with the bottom 2. Now, here you see an interesting thing. If there was no Adam written on that extra spacing between the text, there was no Adam there, you'll just have 2 lines, empty, blank, between the kosher Adam, then you would say that this is an invalid document because you left over 2 lines of spacing. Now, instead of leaving it a blank space, you filled it in with pasala Adam. still that will not invalidate. Just the opposite. This document will still be kosher. So having nothing there is more prone to invalidate a document than having something written there, which is having something written there, but that is a puzzle edim that are written there. So that's a very strange thing. Messiah Lechizkiah, the Gemara says this concept we find in other areas of halacha, that having nothing there is worse than having something puzzle there. And that applies by sukkah. Interestingly enough, the Gemara says, the Amar Chizkiah said, Milo b'kroivim kasher. Chizkiah says, I'm sorry, that if you filled it up, the empty space with relatives, it's kosher. Titama, don't wonder about these things. If it was blank, it would be puzzle. But if it's filled in with kroivim or puzzle edim, the document is kosher. Where do we see such a concept? Shaharei, because we learned this same concept like this. If you have like a 3-walled sukkah and you have a space, right, of in between the schach to the schach. So avir, if you have an empty space of ear space, poisel b'shloisha, then 3 tfachim of empty space in middle of the schach. You have 3 tfachim of empty space. The sukkah is puzzle, because basically it divides the sukkah into half. Let's say you have a 3-walled sukkah and you have schach on the top, and then there's an empty space of 3 tvachim, so then you'll just have a 2-walled sukkah. So it will be puzzle if there was an empty space of 3 tvachim. But let's say schach puzzle, if there's in between, instead of a kosher schach, you have somewhere in between puzzle of schach. So then the shear to puzzle the sukkah is puzzle ba'arba, will puzzle with 4 tvachim. So we see, and this is where we'll end, we see from here that having nothing there is worse than having something there. So if you have no schach there, then the maximum space you could have is 3 tvachim. But if you have disqualified schach there, then you get an extra space in order to puzzle the sukkah. There would be 4 tvachim. And same thing over here. If you have 2 lines of blank space, the document is puzzle. But if in those 2 lines, you have just 2 puzzle edim just signed their names, or 2 small kids signing their names, and then you have kosher edim, the document, nevertheless, will be kosher. So this ends Daf Kuf Samach Beis.
Very interesting. Excellent.